They came in the usual envelope: black tape, red seal, thermal-sensitive strip on the fold that shimmered briefly when I touched it. No insignia, no unit, no initials. Just a protocol number I didn't recognize, and a set of coordinates printed in a font I'd only seen once before. Back when I was temporarily assigned to internal suppression ops, I didn't ask questions back then. I sure as hell didn't now. They used to say that the worst jobs come with the cleanest formatting. No filler. No briefing, no human context. Just orders and location. And this one didn't even come with a name. The envelope had been slipped under my door sometime during the night. I lived alone. No one outside the system had access to this building. And yet the security log for the floor registered no movement between 0200 and 0500. No cameras caught anything. Not even a glitch. That scared me more than anything else. I thought about ignoring it, burning the file, pretending it had never arrived. But that wasn't how it worked. Orders received were considered acknowledged. That was the understanding. You didn't report back. You didn't ask for a chain of command. You moved. The protocol code was Silent Protocol 091. The location, Grid 27 Delta. Southwest of an old decommissioned Air Force range, out in the Utah desert, just below the flat line of anything you'd find on commercial maps. No road access, no active base nearby. Just terrain that hadn't seen anything official since the Cold War. There were no mission details. The attached keycard simply read primary access. Clean and clear. I left the next morning in a vehicle that technically didn't exist. Its plates void of registration, its onboard tracker looping coordinates to an abandoned dam in Arizona. I was instructed to destroy all personal electronics, and a replacement COM unit was built into the vehicle's dash. Military issue. Short-range voice activated. It only responded to one phrase: begin protocol. I didn't try it. I wanted to preserve the illusion of silence a little longer. As I drove across state lines, the terrain began to change: flattened, scrub, red dust, cliffs that seemed to warp in the heat. By the time I reached the outer perimeter of 27 Delta, the road had dissolved entirely into a cracked salt bed, and the signal map on the dash had gone from green to amber to nothing. A chain-link fence surrounded the coordinates, but it had been collapsed inwards long ago. Something had gotten through, not out. That distinction stayed with me. Beyond the fence, a massive concrete hatch was half buried in earth and sand. Its markings faded, but still legible. Unit 7, Strategic Storage Level, Omega. I recognized the build. Cold Warrera nuclear silos. Most had been gutted and repurposed. Some were sealed. This one had been erased. I circled the entrance twice before finally stepping out. No drones, no satellites, no wind. The hatch was sealed with a biometric lock. I pressed my hand against the plate, expecting nothing, but it lit up red, scanned. And the steel bolts began to retract with a sound that felt like an exhale from the ground itself. Dust rose from the edges. The hatch creaked, then opened, revealing a black shaft and a ladder descending into a darkness that didn't reflect light. I clipped my vest, checked my sidearm, activated the wrist light, and lowered myself in. The walls were cold, metallic. The ladder slick with condensation that shouldn't have existed in a place like this. Every 20 feet, a faded white line marked another level. -1, 2, -3. I counted 8 before the bottom. My boots hit metal flooring. A dim light strip flickered on at the far end of a corridor. Just enough to show rusted signage and flaking arrows pointing toward operations, power core, and containment. I radioed the surface, operative entering structure. Commencing sweep. No response. Static only. I wasn't surprised. I spoke the phrase anyway. Some part of me needed to pretend I wasn't alone. The corridor smelled like iron and mildew. The walls echoed with my own movements, but something about the reverb felt off, slightly delayed, like I was hearing myself a fraction of a second too late. I swept left, into what looked like a logistics control room. Broken monitors. Paper files scattered across the floor. Most of the dates were from the mid. One of the documents had a redacted name, but was stamped reactivation denied. Classified under Black Index. I'd only ever heard that phrase used once, before during a training exercise, where the instructor shut down the entire sim when someone asked about a missing handler. It wasn't an official designation. It was a burial. I took my time. Checked the auxiliary power node, Dead. Switched on the backup lamp. The filament blew instantly. Too much residual charge. Something had been drawing power here not long ago. I looked over the wiring. All original except for one cord that had been spliced recently. I followed it through the wall into a narrow maintenance tunnel, where fresh boot prints, mine now joining them, were visible in the dust. The prints ended at a bulkhead sealed with a magnetic lock. The reader was active. My card worked. Beyond it, a staircase descending into deeper levels, not indicated on the schematic I'd seen in the envelope. That was the moment I knew for certain. I hadn't been sent to clean out a silo. I'd been sent into something that wasn't meant to be found. The radio crackled for half a second behind me, just enough to trigger my reflex. I turned. Nothing. Static. Silence. I stood at the top of that staircase, longer than I should have, breathing in the stale air, trying to remember if I'd ever heard of anyone returning from these kinds of operations. We joke, sometimes, that if you get an unsigned envelope, you leave behind a clean will. I hadn't even left a note. No one knew I was here. No one would. The last thing I saw before descending further was a sticker on the stair rail, barely hanging on, its colors faded to the bone. It read, "Authorized personnel only. All breaches will be contained." The corner of the sticker was melted. Not burned. Melted. Like it had been exposed to heat without flame. I descended anyway. The stairwell wound downward like a coiled nerve, rust creeping along its edges, dust clinging to the rails like it had been waiting for skin. I counted each step, not because I wanted to, but because something primal in me needed to mark the distance from the surface in units I could hold on to. Step after step, until the air felt heavier. No longer dry desert oxygen, but something denser, laced with old oil and filtered decay. At the base of the stairwell was a sliding blast door, half open, its tracks bent slightly as if forced. I hesitated only a moment before slipping through sideways. That's when I saw the light. It was faint, flickering, and green. Emergency bulbs embedded in the ceiling strips still had some power, pulsing irregularly like a dying heartbeat. I hadn't activated any system yet. There was no generator humming, but the lights were responding, as if they knew someone was here. The corridor ahead stretched for about 30 meters, branching into several subsections. Signs were minimal operations, sustainment, vault access, but all were coated with a fine soot, and most had been smeared with handprints, not fingerprints. Full dragging hands, like someone had been pulled or tried to crawl. I checked for bullet impacts, signs of structural damage, chemical exposure. Nothing. Whatever happened here hadn't been loud. It had been deliberate. The silence wasn't natural. In dead structures, there's a kind of static ambience, air movement, old metal contracting, wires occasionally twitching with charge. But here, there was only pressure, like the entire space had been vacuum sealed around me. I moved to the operations room first. Standard layout, central table, cracked plexiglass boards with erasable markers still clipped on, faded mission flow charts curling at the corners. One console still blinked with low battery power, enough to boot a menu interface. I leaned over, typed in the default override code, and the terminal unlocked. No login required. Whoever left last didn't log out. The log files were corrupted, but fragments were readable. Most were mundane: inventory checklists, personnel transfers, system maintenance cycles. But a sequence near the end caught my eye. 7 files, all timestamped on the same day. The titles were simple: Entry 01 through ENTRY07. No metadata. No source tags. I opened Entry 01. The screen displayed a grainy image from a security feed. The main elevator shaft, with a single figure standing at the threshold, holding a clipboard. The timestamp read, the 14th of August, 1997. 23:17. The figure turned slightly toward the camera before it cut to static. I opened Entry 02, a hallway, empty. Then motion at the edge of the frame, a blur, vaguely human in size, but with an odd gait. ENTRY03 showed the same hallway, now lit entirely in red. No figures. The next few entries were corrupted. Entry 07 was just a black screen with an audio file attached. I played it through my earpiece. A low hum, then footsteps. Then something like breathing. Then a voice, distant, garbled, but unmistakably human. It said, "Who's the new one?" Then the audio looped. I backed away from the console and turned off my light. Something about that voice had sounded too close. Not on the recording. In the air. I waited in darkness for a full minute, hand on my sidearm. Nothing. When I turned the light back on, I noticed a change on the console screen. One more file had appeared, titled Entry 08. No timestamp, no origin, just a playback bar. I didn't touch it. I moved deeper into the structure. The sustainment hall was worse. Water had leaked through the walls in slow trickles that left rust trails like veins. The storage lockers were all sealed shut, but 2 had been marked with black X's and a triangle beneath. An old symbol used during biohazard drills to mark compromised contents. The air was colder here. Not naturally, it had the chill of mechanical regulation. Something was still maintaining internal climate. Yet the maintenance logs I pulled from the mainframe dated the last power cycle to 2003. The hallway to the vault access section had partially collapsed. I climbed over the rubble, careful not to make noise, though I couldn't have explained why I was suddenly so concerned with sound. On the other side, the hallway widened into a kind of terminal lobby, likely a distribution hub for lower-level materials. In the center of the room was a wide freight elevator platform, large enough to fit a vehicle. It was covered by a steel mesh and powered by an old key-switch system. A toolbox sat beside it, opened. The tools inside were pristine, no dust, no oxidation, recently cleaned. But I had passed no one, heard no one. My boots had left the only fresh prints in the dust. Until now. I saw them near the elevator's edge. A set of prints, smaller than mine, barefooted. The heel pattern shallow, like the person had been walking slowly, almost gliding. They led to the elevator's control panel, then vanished. No return path, no upward trail. Just a stop, I called out. Command, this is Miller. Silo entry confirmed. Facility shows unexpected signs of recent occupation. Please advise. Static, the same endless hum. I checked the platform. The key switch had been bypassed. Someone had hotwired the system, rerouting power from a backup battery located in the wall behind a vent. Not standard issue. Whoever did it knew the layout intimately. A small screen on the elevator control panel blinked a message. Level -5. Access granted. I hadn't authorized that descent. Neither had the system. And yet, there it was. A green light blinking like it had been waiting for me to notice. I scanned the room again. Still no one. That's when I saw the camera. A dough-mounted unit near the ceiling, positioned to overlook the entire chamber. It turned. Not with a jolt, not mechanically. It followed me slowly, deliberately. I raised my light. The lens glared back like an open eye. I drew my sidearm and backed toward the wall. No sound, no movement. Then the camera retracted into the ceiling panel and disappeared. That was when the lights in the chamber dimmed just for a second, but long enough to make the floor hum with current. I could have turned back. Could have climbed the stairwell and sealed the hatch, filed a false report, said the site was structurally unstable and required demolition. But that would have been a lie. And lies didn't hold up in post-op interviews. Not with protocol missions. So I stepped onto the elevator and hit the control for level -5. The platform groaned. Then began to descend, slow and loud, metal grinding against itself in protest. I looked up. The ceiling lights above dimmed out one by one as I dropped beneath their reach. The silo swallowed me, and I let it. The final thing I noticed before the darkness consumed the last trace of level 0 was that the air smelled faintly like ash, but nothing had burned. I checked my weapon, adjusted my cum, and waited to arrive at a floor that wasn't supposed to exist. The silo was never supposed to be active. The reports had been wrong. Or worse, they hadn't been wrong at all. They'd been incomplete, on purpose. And someone had known I'd come down here. The elevator slowed, then stopped. A hiss of pressurized air. The door opened. Level -5 was lit, and someone was breathing, not me. Behind the wall, close, steady, waiting. The door slid open with the reluctant groan of ancient mechanics forced back into motion after decades of silence. I didn't raise my weapon at first. Something told me it wouldn't matter. The hallway beyond level -5 was too well lit for a facility supposedly sealed since the 90s. The fluorescent strips overhead pulsing with a quiet consistency that defied every law of electrical entropy. They weren't humming, they weren't flickering. They just burned steady and low, as if they'd never been turned off. The corridor extended in both directions, but there was no signage, no directional labels, no arrows, just blank steel. I stepped off the platform slowly, expecting my boots to echo, but the floor absorbed the sound. Some kind of rubberized coating. Deliberate. Noise control. That kind of material didn't belong in Cold War design. Someone had made modifications. I turned right. It felt instinctive, like I was following a trail I couldn't see. The air was still and filtered, and it carried a low mechanical pulse beneath the surface, almost like breath. Every few meters, I passed pressure-sealed doors, each unmarked. Each recessed into the wall like they were never meant to be opened casually. I stopped at one and ran my hand along the seam. The metal was warm. Too warm. I tapped the panel. No response. No controls. I moved on. About 50 meters down, I found the first sign of structural inconsistency. The corridor branched left into a sloped ramp descending again. This wasn't on any schematic. I pulled out the map I'd reconstructed from the surface logs, but there was no mention of sublevels beyond. 5. Whatever lay ahead had been added after the original blueprints had been archived. The walls along the ramp were different, darker, reinforced, with a mesh-like texture embedded beneath the paint. It was newer construction, no more than 15 years old, but layered over the older framework, like a parasite wrapping itself around bone. I descended. As I moved, I began to notice changes in the atmosphere. The air thickened subtly, not in temperature or pressure, but in sensation. My breath felt like it pushed through something unseen. The further I went, the more I had to concentrate to keep my thoughts straight. I felt my hand twitch, and for a second, I didn't remember raising it. Then I heard the first sound that didn't come from my gear. A rhythmic click, like claws against tile. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps again. I froze. It wasn't close, but the acoustics down here didn't follow logic. The sound echoed without direction, bounced in ways that made pinpointing it impossible. I moved slower. My wrist light caught the edge of a symbol painted onto the wall in red. Not spray paint, not blood. It had the thick texture of lead marker, the kind used in radiation tagging. A single circle intersected by a vertical slash. I didn't recognize it. I made a note on my pad, snapped a photo. The lens of my camera adjusted 3 times before finally focusing like it didn't want to see it. At the bottom of the ramp, I reached another door. This one had a panel and actual digital interface, with a biometric reader and passcode entry. My card didn't work, but the biometric scanner lit up, pulsing softly. I hesitated, then placed my palm against it. The panel scanned, processed, then beeped in approval. The door hissed open. That shouldn't have happened. My clearance was high, but this was outside any operational sphere I'd ever been assigned. If it accepted me, it meant one of 2 things. Either my access had been boosted by someone without telling me, or whoever had designed this door expected me. Neither option settled well. Beyond the door was a circular chamber, maybe 30 feet across, lined with terminal stations and an observation ring above, which looked down from a level I hadn't seen any staircase to. The center of the room housed a cylindrical shaft, sealed by transparent material, some form of composite glass. Scratched from the inside. Inside the shaft was a chair, bolted to the floor. Restraints hung loose from its arms. Something had sat there recently. A metal tray beside it held what looked like syringes, most of them broken. Scattered across the floor were fragments of audio tape, the old magnetic kind, and a reel labeled in faded pen, Subject E Session 3. I didn't touch it. I checked the terminals. All dark. But the chair's restraints had a red LED, still blinking. I leaned closer. On the back of the chair, etched deep into the steel, with what looked like a knife, were the words, "Do not descend." I turned toward the wall behind the console. There, hidden in shadow, was a stairwell going down. Spiral, cramped. No lighting. This wasn't an elevator shaft anymore. It had become something else. I activated a backup floodlight and stepped into the stairs. The descent was slow, disorienting. Every 5 steps, the walls changed texture from concrete to smooth ceramic, to rough rock, then back to metal. It made no sense. Construction couldn't have layered these materials so inconsistently. It was like I was moving through geological strata, not architectural design. The air turned cold, then hot, then dry, then damp. My floodlight flickered, but never failed. I began to hear noises again, a low pulse. Not mechanical, biological. Wet, inhale, exhale, then silence, then again. But never in rhythm with me. I lost track of time. The stairwell didn't end for what felt like an hour. When it did, it opened into a narrow horizontal corridor with no markings at all. A hallway carved into stone, but too clean to be natural. The floor was wet. The walls sweated condensation. Somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed like chains being dragged slowly across a concrete floor. I tried to radio command again. Miller reporting. Entered unauthorized sublevel. Facility continues below documented depth. Please respond. Static. Then a click. Then the faint sound of someone whispering, Miller. I froze. Who is this? I demanded. Nothing. Then a second voice, my own voice, repeating the same words I had just said. Miller, reporting, entered unauthorized sublevel. The audio looped twice, then cut. I advanced, sidearm drawn, light cutting through the mist. The corridor turned sharply to the left, and at the end of it was an old service elevator, the kind you see in coal mines, cage walls, exposed pulleys. The call button was lit. I hadn't touched it. I approached. There was a single button inside, down. No floor numbers. No control panel. No emergency stop. The lift was already waiting. The cage door stood open. I stepped in. The door slammed shut behind me, and the lift began to descend. There was no sound of machinery, no cables, no chains. Just gravity. Just the crushing pressure of depth. The light inside the cage dimmed, then died completely. I stood in blackness, breath held, heart hammering, every instinct screaming that I had passed the edge of mapped reality. I wasn't inside a silo anymore. I was inside something that was never meant to be built. Or perhaps never meant to be found. The cage kept descending. And I realized something horrifying. I hadn't pressed the button. Darkness settled into me, not like the absence of light, but as a saturation of a drowning black that coated everything I was, even behind my eyelids. I stood inside the descending cage and breathed through my nose, shallow and quiet, trying to regulate the rising static behind my eyes. There was no way to tell how far down I was going. No shudder in the metal frame, no clank of pulleys, no screech of brakes. Just this endless, floating drop, like the elevator was falling inside a sealed vacuum. Eventually, the walls around me began to warm, not the air, not my body, but the steel itself. As if the surrounding pressure was compressing the temperature inward, baking the substructure from without. And that's when the smell began. It didn't hit all at once. It crept, molecule by molecule, like something testing the limits of my awareness. At first, it was metallic coppery and sterile, like fresh blood in an operating room. Then came something sour, acrid, faintly acidic, the scent of chemical degradation mixed with human rot. It clung to my throat and coiled into my sinuses. I reached for the rebreather, clipped to my vest, engaged the carbon filter, and kept my focus ahead. Then the elevator slowed, not suddenly, not with a jolt, but as though it were reluctantly conceding to gravity. The lights didn't return. The silence didn't break. The cage finally stopped, and I heard it. A faint hydraulic hiss, the kind used in airlock systems. Then the metal lattice slid open behind me, not in front, forcing me to turn to exit. I hesitated, scanned the black, and took a single step into whatever lay beyond. My boot splashed. The floor was wet, viscous, not water, something denser. My floodlight took 3 attempts to stabilize, but when it did, I saw where I was. A tunnel, ribbed with support struts, roughly cylindrical, walls covered in dark, glistening residue that ran down from the ceiling in slow, sluggish veins. It was too symmetrical to be natural, but too crude to be modern. Like it had been bored out by force, then abandoned halfway through a second phase of construction. The walls breathed condensation. Puddles collected along the sloped edges of the floor. And that smell, that godforsaken stench. It was stronger, here, like something behind the walls had gone rancid long ago, but its decomposition had only just begun to matter. I advanced slowly, keeping the floodlight ahead of me, tracking every movement, every shift of air. About 10 meters in, I reached a curve. The tunnel turned left, and from beyond the bend came a low thumping sound, distant, deliberate, almost mechanical. I thought it might be a pump, or something imitating one. I rounded the curve. There was a door, a massive bulkhead, circular, reinforced, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Not military, not scientific. Carved, not stamped. They glowed faintly under the beam of my light, as if reacting to spectrum alone. In the center of the door was a panel that looked like a biometric interface, but it was organic veined, soft-looking, almost like petrified flesh. I didn't want to touch it, but I didn't have a choice. I stepped forward and pressed my gloved palm to it. The door pulsed. It didn't open immediately. It shivered. Something inside clicked wetly, like sinew pulling against a lock. Then the whole mass unsealed with a hiss and receded into the tunnel walls, like muscle folding into itself. Beyond the threshold was a chamber round, domed easily 40 feet across, and lit from no source I could see. The walls glowed dim red, like magma behind glass, and the floor was covered in shallow pools of black liquid that didn't reflect anything. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. Upon it, a box. A simple military-style case, the kind used for field equipment or encrypted data cores. I approached it carefully, checking for wires, pressure plates, thermal sensors. Nothing. The box sat inert. I crouched. There was a label on the side, mostly eroded, but a few words remained. Retrieval denied. Black index do not transmit. There was no lock. I opened it. Inside were photos, hundreds of them, black and white, mostly some thermal. Images of bodies dissected, burned, fused with machinery. Others showed blueprints I couldn't interpret. One depicted what looked like a mass of cables plugged into a brain. Another, a figure standing inside a chamber, much like the one I now occupied, face turned away from the camera. But in the reflection behind them, a second face looked back. Something long and wet and eyeless. I kept flipping. The last photo in the stack was of me, standing in this chamber. Floodlight raised, mouth slightly open. Behind me, just beyond the range of my lamp, something was watching. I froze. Not because I believed it couldn't be real, but because I knew it had to be. I turned, slowly. The chamber was empty. Or it wanted to be. I packed the photos back into the case, sealed it, and slung it over my shoulder. As I backed away from the pedestal, the chamber lights dimmed just a little, enough to signal. Enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I exited back into the tunnel and followed a different passage. One I hadn't noticed before, narrow, almost hidden behind a fold in the chamber's perimeter. It sloped upward slightly, like a service route. The floor here was dry. The walls less organic, more concrete, returned, familiar. I moved faster. I began to hope this was a way back up to level -5. That hope evaporated when I saw the sign on the wall. A metal plate, warped but readable. It said, level -6. I hadn't gone up. I'd gone down. The tunnel widened again into a corridor of doors. Standard issue now. Military design, numbered. Some open, some sealed. I passed door 14, 15, 16. 16, then stopped at 17. It was open. Inside was a small room, with a bed, a desk, a toilet, a single surveillance camera in the corner, a speaker grill above the door, a cot with a faded blanket. This was a holding cell. But for what? I stepped in, scanned the room. There were scratches on the inside of the doorframe, dozens, hundreds, all aligned, all vertical, as if someone had been marking time, not with days, but with seconds. The wall above the bed had something smeared on it. I turned up my light. It was blood, old, dried in patterns, words written again and again. One stood out, remember. I didn't want to understand. But I already did. This wasn't a storage facility. It wasn't even containment. It was experimentation, iteration. And I was walking through the graveyard of everything that hadn't worked. I moved to the desk. There was a folder. Handwritten notes, observations, behavioral triggers, sleep deprivation thresholds, sections on sensory manipulation. The last page was a memo, not signed, just a header. Subject recognized self, underlined 3 times. Then, initiate, dissolution. I left the room. The air in the corridor had shifted. No longer just stench. There was something fragrant beneath it now, sweet, sickly, like rotting flowers. The smell of something that used to be beautiful. I pressed forward, and at the far end of the hall, past door 24, I saw movement. Something rounded the corner and vanished. No sound, no rush of motion, just the suggestion of limbs. I didn't call out. I just followed. The hallway narrowed the deeper I followed, as if the structure itself recoiled inward with every step I took. Forcing my shoulders to draw in, the floodlight beam tightening until it barely cleared the walls. My boots no longer echoed. The floor here wasn't made for sound. It absorbed intention, flattened weight, dulled movement. The stink of rot and metal thickened. But there was something else bleeding through it now, zone, like the air after a lightning strike, or the charge before a defibrillator snaps to life. It hummed just beneath my skin, crawling into the cracks between breath and thought. I kept my weapon drawn, but pointed down. Instinct told me that if I raised it at the wrong moment, the wrong thing might look directly at me. I passed a junction that wasn't marked on my mental map of the structure. There were no doors, here just blank, featureless intersections, and walls scored with the residue of something dragged. Not fluid, not tools, not cables. Something that resisted. Then I found the door. It stood alone, slightly recessed, as if ashamed of itself. Not marked, not numbered. No biometric panel, no handle. The metal was unlike anything else in the Silonaut, brushed aluminum or cold steel. But dark, with a dull, slate finish, too smooth for any industrial function. Too flawless to have been here for decades, and yet too worn at the base to be new. My light passed over it and didn't reflect. It absorbed, like the door swallowed photons, as easily as it would swallow sound. I moved closer. My boots made no noise. My breath thinned. The door had no seam. No frame. Just an outline. Imperfect. Barely perceptible. But there. I didn't remember choosing to touch it. But I was already doing it. The surface was warm. Not heat warm like breath. Like exhale. It responded to me not mechanically. Not digitally. But like a living thing. I felt the metal twitch under my palm, and a pressure bloomed in my ears. Not pain, just force, like a descending tone too low to fully register, but too real to ignore. Then I heard it, a sound from the other side. A whisper, not words, just the cadence of something aware of me, something with lungs. The door hissed. It didn't open in the traditional sense. It folded not into the wall, but inward on itself, like pages collapsing. What stood beyond wasn't a room. It wasn't even a chamber. It was a corridor that didn't match any known architecture I'd encountered in my training, missions, or classified records. Its angles were wrong, visually subtle, mathematically obscene. The hallway bent in slight, constant increments, each degree just enough to make the light bend unnaturally. I should have turned around. I should have logged the coordinates and returned for backup, but I didn't. I stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was thicker, but colder, like walking into a cryovault, except there was no visible source for the temperature drop. I checked my wrist thermometer dead. The screen flashed static, then froze. My internal HUD inside the helmet flickered and displayed a series of characters. I didn't recognize symbols, instead of numbers, looping geometries that spun in place and then vanished. The corridor ahead sloped downward in a perfect spiral. But the descent didn't feel vertical. It felt like walking forward and downward at the same time, like the space reoriented around the shape of my body. The floor looked solid, but offered no resistance. My boots made no contact sound. The walls vibrated at intervals, short pulses that traveled through the soles of my feet and into my chest. I passed a wall panel. I didn't look at it directly, but I saw it move. There was something behind it, pressed thin against the metal, its outline warping the surface like a figure underwater. I walked faster. After 3 full rotations of the corridor's spiral, I reached a junction 2 doors. One left, one right, identical. No markings, no features, just mass. I faced the right, and felt nothing. Then the left hand, something shifted behind it. A slow shuffle. No urgency, no fear. Just waiting. I opened the right door. It was a mistake. The chamber inside was bathed in red light, not from fixtures, but from the walls themselves. They glowed faintly, pulsing. A central platform hovered above a black pit, unsupported, suspended in the middle of the room, like an altar or an offering. On the platform stood a chair. The same kind as before, but this one was occupied. The figure didn't move. It wore a suit similar to mine, military grade, but older, outdated. The kind phased out over 15 years ago. Its helmet was intact, visor blackened. Its posture slumped, but not dead rigid, like a figure waiting for instructions. I approached slowly, weapon raised. I called out. No response. I reached the platform and stepped onto it. There was no mechanical support, no vibration, just stillness. The air grew thinner. I knelt by the figure. The suit had no name tag, no rank, just a single emblem on the shoulder, a circle intersected by a slash. The same symbol I'd seen painted in red earlier. I tapped the visor. The head turned slowly toward me. I staggered back. It didn't move aggressively, just with precision, as if pulled by wire. Then the visor cleared. Not like glass-like fog, dissipating. Behind it was my face. Not a copy, not a twin, it was me. Mouth open, eyes glazed, unfocused. Lips moving silently, mouthing something I couldn't hear. Then it spoke. Not with its mouth, with my headset. Exit denied. I stumbled off the platform. Behind me, the door slammed shut. No lock, no latch, just closure. I turned, banged my fist on the surface. No give, no sound beyond the chamber. Then the platform began to rise. Slowly, silently, the figure remained in place. Its head turned upward, toward the ceiling that I now saw. Wasn't a ceiling at all, it was a mirrored reflection of the room below. Except in the mirror, there were two of me standing beside each other, facing the chair. One of them blinked. I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I burst through the right side door I had entered through, expecting to find the spiral corridor. Instead, I was in a hallway I'd never seen as straight. Narrow shaft lit by strobing white lights, and at the end, a hatch with warning stripes and an ancient key lock. I bolted toward it, shoulder-checking the door when I reached it, twisting the handle with strength I didn't know I had. The hatch gave swung open, and I stumbled into what looked like a maintenance corridor. Industrial, familiar pipes, grates, steel, sanity. I collapsed against the wall and breathed. The stench was back. Stronger now, coating my mouth. But I was out of the impossible geometry. For now, I looked behind me. The hatch was gone. The hallway was blank steel. I was somewhere else entirely. The lights flickered above me, and from behind the wall, something sighed. The corridor I now found myself in was barely lit, but its familiarity offered no comfort. It mimicked standard military construction or service tunnel, lined with pipework and access grates. Low-hanging conduit racks and emergency lamps that flickered like eyes trying not to close. I rose to my feet slowly, testing the weight of the case still strapped to my shoulder, the weight of my thoughts heavier. I tried the comms again, voice barely above a whisper. Miller, surface contact requested. Potential breach of structure integrity. Repeat, requesting evac signal. Static. Then a faint blip. A burst. Then silence. I let the unit hang loose against my chest. Whatever was down here wanted me to think I was alone. Or worse, it wanted me to hope I wasn't. I began walking. Every 20 feet the tunnel branched, and every time I chose the left path. Not by logic, not by instinct, but because it felt like anything else would be stepping into something's mouth. My boots made the slightest squeak against the grated steel, the rhythm of my steps echoing just enough to simulate the illusion of being followed. I didn't check. Not yet. I knew that once I started looking over my shoulder, I'd never stop. The walls started to change again. First it was the paint peeling in some places, bubbling in others, as if reacting to heat that no longer existed. Then it was the metal itself, warped subtly inward, like pressure had built behind it long ago, and never fully receded. Then came the door. It was positioned midway down a narrowing branch corridor, its frame slightly tilted, like the structure had shifted, but the door refused to move with it. I stopped in front of it. Standard handle, manual lock. No warning labels. Just a plaque above that read, Archive 7A. I remembered that designation. It had been listed in the data I reviewed in the operations room, near level -5, buried among non-critical logs and system commands. At the time, I had dismissed it. It had seemed like nothing, but here it was. I opened the door. Inside, the space was modest, maybe 5 by 5 meters, lit by a dim overhead bulb that buzzed inconsistently. A desk stood in the center, bare, except for a file folder and a tape recorder. Metal shelving units lined the walls, filled with unmarked binders, audio cassettes, loose documents without headers or stamps. The air was dry here, sterile. The first place I'd entered that didn't reek of decomposition or chemical sabotage. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. I picked up the file folder. Inside were photos, grainy black hand whites of this very hallway, of this room, from angles I couldn't place. One showed the door, slightly ajar. Another, the desk. Another, a photo taken from above, showing a man standing where I stood now. I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back was a date from 5 years ago, and one word, Miller. I dropped it. I reached for the tape recorder. There was no play button, only a red light, blinking. No sound played, but the tape inside was moving, recording. I didn't speak. I watched it spin, then slowly, sound filtered in static at first, then a voice. My voice. This is Miller. Time unknown. Location uncertain. I've entered Archive 7A. I've entered Archive 7A. I've entered. I slammed the power switch. The tape stopped. The light went dark. I turned to leave, and froze. The door was gone. The wall was seamless. The frame dissolved into bare steel, as though no entrance had ever existed. I ran my hands along the surface. Nothing. No seam. No outline. I backed away, breathing faster. The bulb above buzzed louder, then popped, plunging the room into shadow. Only my floodlight remained, and even it had begun to flicker. I swept the beam across the room. The shelves had changed. They were empty now, except for one item. My helmet. The one I was wearing. But I was still wearing it. And yet, there it sat, on the shelf, scratched in the same place, the visor marked with dust, the left side panel taped, where I'd cracked it during training 2 years ago. I moved to touch it. My hand passed through it like smoke. The room rippled. I staggered, caught the desk for balance, but the desk was gone. Now it was a console. The chair behind it was the one I'd seen in the earlier chamber, the one with the restraints. I wasn't in Archive 7A anymore. I was in the red chamber again. The pedestal, the pit, the mirror above. But this time, the platform was empty. The chair was empty. But I could hear it, breathing, not from the room. From the mirror, I looked up. In the reflection, I was still seated. I hadn't moved. I was strapped to the chair, struggling, mouth open, eyes wide. I looked down again, still standing, still alone. I raised my light toward the mirror, and in that instant, the reflection stopped moving. The figure in the chair, my reflection, snapped its head, toward me. Not toward the me in the mirror, but toward the me looking at it. The eyes locked. The mouth moved. You're late. The light surged. The walls pulsed. A tone rang out from nowhere, high, pure, deafening. Then silence. Then I was back, standing in the corridor again. Same metal floor. Same grated ceiling. Same walls. Archive 7A was gone. The door was gone, but in my hand, the photo remained. My photo. I shoved it into my pocket and began moving, faster now, not running. Not yet. I turned each corner with hesitation, expecting the layout to collapse again, expecting walls to open where they shouldn't, and space to stretch where it had no right. It didn't. Not for now. I passed a junction that felt familiar, turned left, then right, then another left, and then I stopped. I was back at the door, Archive 7A. The same tilt, the same plaque, the same faint scratch below the handle. I backed away. My mind reeled, running calculations of angle and distance and probability. I had looped. Not a spatial loop knot, a navigational one, but a structural mimicry. The silo had reconstructed the sequence of my movement and placed it back in front of me. I opened the door again. Inside, empty chamber, no shelf, no tape, no desk. Just one object in the center of the floor. The box I had recovered earlier. I stepped inside. Behind me, the door closed. The walls pulsed. The loop had tightened. It wasn't a room, it was a process, and I had triggered it. The weight of the box on my shoulder was like a stone pulling me deeper into a cavern I wasn't meant to explore. The walls around me had begun to pulse with a rhythm I couldn't place. A subtle heartbeat that seemed to echo not just through the metal, but through the marrow of my bones. I paused, the cold seeping through my gloves, and I fumbled for the unit clipped to my vest. The device that had so far been my only tether to a world outside this labyrinth. I keyed the microphone and said the words I'd been repeating for hours. A mantra now. Command, this is Miller. Location unknown. Requesting status update. Please respond. Static. Then silence. I repeated the call. Nothing. No response. But then, through the white noise, a crackle and a voice. Not a voice I recognized, but one familiar. My voice. It was distorted, warped, a garbled echo that barely carried the syllables clearly. Command Miller. I'm here, it said, broken like a scratched record. Repeating and looping with increasing distortion until it sounded like a chorus of desperate ghosts trapped in the circuitry. I gripped the radio tighter, a cold sweat slicking my palms, and whispered, "Who's there?" The response was a whisper too low to be heard, just a breath, a subtle intonation of the same words, but not from the speakers. From inside my helmet, inside my head. I clutched the sides of my visor, fighting the rising tide of panic, but the voice persisted. Miller. Miller. Threading itself through the static, winding around my thoughts like a poisonous vine. I forced my eyes open and scanned the corridor, the light from my wrist beacon trembling in my grip, casting long, dancing shadows against the warped walls. I tried to ground myself. This was a military operation. Protocol demanded discipline, rationality, control. The voice was interference. Maybe a glitch. Maybe a recorded playback loop on a dead channel. Remnants of a past mission echoing in the frequency. But the voice was mine. It spoke words I had never said aloud. Commands I had never issued. Directions to places I had never been. The tone was not commanding. It was fearful, broken, almost pleading. You shouldn't be here, Miller. The radio sputtered, then cleared briefly, and a new voice emerged beneath the static softer. Unfamiliar, but human. Turn back. Leave now. But the voice was overlaid by mine, repeating again. Continue the protocol. Complete the sweep. Initiate containment. The conflict in the audio mirrored the turmoil inside me. The room I stood in began to vibrate. An almost imperceptible thrum building to a low hum that filled the air and resonated through the steel ribs of the silo. I swallowed hard, my breath visible in the sudden chill that swept the corridor, and pressed on, driven by a mixture of duty and dread. I moved deeper, the light struggling to penetrate the thickening gloom. And with every step, the voice followed, sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, always mine, always fracturing. I reached a fork in the tunnel, where a faint light spilled from the left passage, flickering like a failing heartbeat. The right was swallowed in shadows that seemed to breathe and shift. The radio sparked again. Miller, turn left. The voice was gentle now, urgent. But my gut twisted, with the warning echoing beneath. Turn right, turn right. I hesitated, the conflict mirrored in my mind. I chose left. The corridor narrowed, walls closing in, as if the silo itself tried to swallow me whole. I passed door after door, all sealed, all marked only with red hazard stripes and cryptic symbols, scrawled in hand. The smell was different here, faintly chemical, acidic, like burnt plastic and old blood. My skin crawled. I felt unseen, unfathomable, tracking my movement from the darkness behind those doors. The voice whispered again. You are late, they are waiting. Ahead, a shadow detached itself from the wall and flickered into the corridor, a figure, indistinct, shifting, as if made of smoke and light. I raised my weapon and called out, "Identify yourself." The figure halted, then began to dissolve, fading back into the dark. The radio crackled violently, and the voice screamed, overlapping itself in a cacophony of fragmented words. Containment breach. Initiate lockdown. Do not trust the reflection. Do not trust the voice. I stumbled back, heart pounding, breath ragged. My own voice screamed inside my helmet, indistinguishable from the disembodied warnings spilling from the radio. I spun around, searching for an exit or any sign of reality. The corridor behind me was gone, replaced by a solid wall, seamless and cold. Panic surged, but training forced me to steady my breath. I keyed the radio desperately. Command. Repeat. Command. Do you read me? Only static answered. The voice came once more, this time from within. I am you. I have always been you. We are the protocol. The words echoed through my mind, as clear as a scream in an empty room. The silo wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and I was both prisoner and warden. I sank to my knees, the weight of inevitability crushing me. The box on my shoulder felt heavier still, an anchor to a past I couldn't remember, and a future I dreaded. The radio clicked off. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead. The voice whispered one last command. Finish what you started, Miller, or become what you feared. And I realized then the truth. I was never alone. Not in this place. Not in this protocol. My own voice had been the first sign, the cruelest echo in a chamber where time and identity folded in on themselves, and silence was the only way out. The silence that swallowed the corridor was suffocating, heavier than any air I'd ever breathed. Each step I took felt like dragging a chain behind men anchor, tied to memories I couldn't quite grasp, and to a future I feared might never come. The box I carried shifted at my side, a constant reminder that what I had stumbled upon was far beyond any standard operation. I had to know. I had to find answers, even if those answers were written in the language of madness. My boots echoed faintly on the metal grate floor as I followed the twisting passages deeper, the air growing colder and drier. Somewhere, far off, a distant thrum began to pulse through the walls, like a heartbeat out of sync with my own. I rounded a corner into a small chamber, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from exposed wiring. The room was cluttered with old equipment, rusted toolboxes, frayed cables, and a heavy metal desk weighed down by scattered papers and dusty binders. Against the far wall stood a shelf stuffed with leather-bound journals, some tattered, some intact. I approached cautiously, the sense of unseen eyes prickling my skin. My fingers trembled as I picked one up. The leather was brittle, the edges worn from years of handling. The journal's cover bore no title, only a faded insignia, intertwined circle, and / the same symbol I had seen scrawled on the walls and emblazoned on the strange suit. I opened it. The first entries were clinical, detached, handwritten logs of personnel movements, equipment status, environmental readings. Dates, times, and cryptic codes filled the pages, each note penned in a neat, precise script that betrayed no emotion. But as I flipped through, the tone changed. The handwriting grew shakier, the sentences shorter, more fragmented. A chilling pattern emerged. The author had begun to unravel. Entry after entry detailed strange occurrences, inexplicable noises, equipment malfunctions, missing personnel. There were mentions of the Watcher, unseen breaches, and voices in the comms. One passage, dated nearly a decade before I arrived, described a failed containment protocol that led to the loss of an entire team. Their disappearance recorded only as a blip on a corrupted video feed. Then I found a series of entries under the heading Subject Miller. The writing here was different, more personal. The author chronicled interactions with someone referred to only as the operative, noting his erratic behavior and increasing paranoia. One note described the operative's fixation on the silo's lower levels, his insistence that something was alive beneath the concrete and steel. Another detailed how he refused to obey recall orders, claiming he needed to complete the sweep before extraction. I swallowed hard. The next pages were almost illegible, smeared with what looked like tears or something else. The final entry was typed, not handwritten, as if hurriedly printed in the last moments. The date was stamped but left redacted. The text read, Protocol 091 is compromised. Subject Miller exhibits full dissociation. Voices internalized. Identity fractured. The loop is active. Extraction impossible. Initiate containment breach protocols. End of line. And beneath that, in bold handwriting, a single name scrawled like a signature, Miller. I dropped the journal, heart pounding, the cold pressing harder against my chest. I was the operative. I was the subject. This journal was not a relic of the past. It was my history, my future. The silo was a living thing, folding time and identity into a labyrinth from which there was no escape. I tried to steady my breath as a new sound filled the chamber, the unmistakable echo of footsteps approaching. Slow and deliberate. I turned toward the door, weapon raised, but the figure that stepped through was not human. Its form shimmered at the edges, blurred like a broken transmission, and where its eyes should have been, was only darkness. It spoke not in words, but in a voice that resonated within my mind, layered with my own. "You are the protocol. You are the loop. You cannot leave." I fired. The shot rang hollow, passing through the figure like smoke, scattering into fragments of shadow and light. The footsteps halted. Silence. Then the journal's pages fluttered open on their own, settling on a blank sheet that rapidly filled with text I couldn't read. The air thickened, and I felt the walls pulse in time with my heartbeat. My reflection appeared in a cracked glass panel, but it was not me. The eyes were empty, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. I was inside the silo's story now, trapped between what had been and what could never be. And the last thing I heard before the darkness claimed me was my own voice, whispering from somewhere deep inside, "Remember." The journal slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. Its pages splayed open like the wings of a fallen bird, fragile and torn. I stood frozen in the cramped chamber, the low hum of machinery and distant echoes pressing into my ears like a chorus of unseen watchers. The air had thickened with something unseen, something alive, and I could feel it crawling along the hairs on my neck, settling deep in the pit of my stomach. My breaths came shallow and quick, each one scraping against the metallic walls, like dry leaves in a hollow. I forced myself to look up and ahead, toward the observation chamber I had passed earlier, glass-walled room, elevated above the corridors, designed to oversee, to watch, to control. It had seemed empty before. Now, it did not. There was movement inside, subtle, deliberate, as if the air itself rippled in place of a body. A figure shifted behind the fogged glass, indistinct, but unmistakably alive. It didn't run, didn't wave, or cry out. It simply stood, watching, waiting. The features were blurred, distorted by condensation and shadow, but the shape was human or once was. I raised my light slowly, the beams slicing through the murk, searching for details, for recognition, for a sign that this was something I could comprehend or control. The figure did not flinch. I called out, voice barely audible, swallowed by the cavernous silence. "Who's there?" No reply. No movement beyond a slight shiver in the glass. A breath fogged the pain on the inside. I pressed my palm flat against the cold surface, feeling the condensation dampen my glove. The chill of the glass seeped into my skin and spread like a frostbite warning. "I'm here to help," I said, though I knew that was a lie. Behind the glass, the figure leaned forward, placing a hand against the wall, fingertips splayed. The movement disturbed the condensation, leaving faint, distorted prints, like ghostly sigils. Then it straightened. The outline sharpening for a moment, a glimpse of something grotesque beneath the haze, a twisted mask of skin. Too smooth, too pale, eyes too large and dark to be human. It turned away, melting back into the shadows of the chamber. The air shifted, the low hum morphing into a rhythmic pounding, like the heartbeat of some colossal beast buried deep in the earth. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the impossible. A sentinel, a prisoner, or a remnant. Was it watching me, protecting me, or was I the prey? My radio crackled suddenly, the static slicing through the silence like a blade. I jerked, heart racing. The voice was garbled, fragmented, distorted beyond recognition. But a single phrase cut through clearly. "Do not trust the chamber." Then, nothing. I keyed the mic, but only received silence. I pivoted, aiming my light down the hallway from which I'd come, expecting to find refuge, escape, or salvation. Instead, the corridor stretched endlessly, warping subtly, folding back on itself like the silo was breathing, reshaping its own architecture to trap me further. Panic clawed at my ribs, but I swallowed it, forcing focus. I scanned the walls, searching for any exit, any sign, any trace of human order in the madness. My light caught something. A doorway half open, leading into a maintenance corridor lined with pipes and cables, dimly lit by the weak glow of emergency panels. I moved toward it cautiously, every footstep echoing hollowly. The door creaked, a sound so loud it seemed sacrilegious in this place of silence. I slipped inside. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of shadows and whispers. The pulse in the walls became a drumbeat in my ears, faster now, syncing with my racing heartbeat. I passed junction after junction, each turn disorienting. twisting the silo's geometry beyond comprehension. Somewhere in the distance, a faint scraping sound emerged, slow and deliberate, like nails drawn across steel. It grew louder, closer, accompanied by a wet, slapping noise that made my skin crawl. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a chamber, lit only by the eerie phosphorescence of mold or fungus, thriving in the darkness. The walls glistened with dampness, and the floor was slick with unknown fluids that reflected the ghostly light. Something moved in the shadows fast, jerking, impossible to track. I raised my weapon, but the thing slipped behind a pillar before I could get a clear shot. A whisper echoed through the chamber, low and cold, not carried by the air, but vibrating through the steel beneath my boots. "You cannot leave." The voice was layered, my voice beneath it, and another older, twisted, angry. My visor fogged over as the temperature dropped, breath crystallizing in the stale air. The silo was alive. The silo was aware, and it was hungry for what I was carrying for me. I backed toward the entrance, the feeling of being watched intensifying. The observation chamber loomed above, its darkened windows reflecting nothing but my own terror. I realized then the truth. The silo wasn't just a structure of steel and concrete. It was a maze of memories and shadows, a prison for lost souls and fractured identities. And I had just become another ghost trapped within its endless depths. The path back twisted beneath me, folding and unraveling, and as I hurried forward, the whispers grew into a chorus of voices pleading, accusing, and laughing in a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Somewhere deep inside, the silo was closing in, and I was running out of time. The urgency of the pounding voices receded behind the mechanical drone of my own heartbeat, thudding deep within my chest like a warning drum. The silo's oppressive architecture pressed tighter around me as I stumbled through the corridors. Shadows clawing at my heels with every flicker of failing light. The whispered echoes, fragmented and jarring, blended into a cacophony that threatened to unravel the fragile threads of my sanity. Each step I took seemed to dissolve the line between reality and the endless looping nightmare I was trapped inside. Then, like a death knell cutting through the chaos, the unmistakable sound of a massive steel door slamming shut echoed down the hall behind me. It was the emergency lockdown. I spun on my heel, breath ragged, eyes wide, searching the length of the corridor for the source. The steel gates gigantic and reinforced rattled as they sealed off passageways in all directions, cutting me off from any retreat. The ambient hum shifted into a lower, more urgent tone. Red emergency lights began to pulse along the ceilings and walls, casting everything into stark contrast and bathing the silo in a hellish glow that flickered and faltered, threatening to extinguish at any moment. The oppressive atmosphere was no longer just physical, it felt alive, a beast in a cage, tightening its grip on its prey. I had triggered something catastrophic. The entire facility was locking down. I cursed silently as the reality sank in. My survival now depended on my ability to manually override the lockdown system. Somewhere deep beneath this monstrous labyrinth lay the emergency control panel, a last resort mechanism buried far below the lowest official level I'd ever been assigned to. Level -9. My legs moved on instinct, adrenaline surging to push me through corridors warped and twisted beyond reason, away from the collapsing pathways I'd traversed earlier. My mind raced, remembering fragments from training. The silo was designed to be impenetrable, a fortress of steel and concrete meant to hold things that could not be allowed to escape. Its systems were redundant, fail-safe, and manually controlled in the deepest sections. It was also a trap. The journey downward was merciless. I fought claustrophobia as the hallways constricted, twisting into spirals tighter than before, forcing me to stoop and contort. The temperature fluctuated, wildly bone-chilling cold, giving way to stifling heat that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. The air became thick and stale, making every breath a laborious effort. My suit's environmental controls labored to maintain balance, but the readings flickered, warning of critical failures. There was no signal from command, no external contact. I was alone. A faint metallic scent-tarnished copper and burnt ozone guided me deeper. The pulse in the walls was no longer random, but steady and deliberate, syncing with a low mechanical thudding that seemed to resonate from the core of the silo. Each step brought me closer to the heart of this buried beast, and to the control hub I hoped would reverse the lockdown. The corridors began to bear more signs of their history. Rusted conduits, sparking intermittently, scorch marks from unknown incidents, and faint stains that my mind refused to identify. I passed sealed chambers and locked doors, their surfaces scarred with warnings and hastily scrawled messages like "containment breach" and "do not proceed." One door bore fresh mark scratches, jagged and deep, like desperate claws trying to escape. Time lost meaning. Minutes, hours, or days I couldn't tell, blurring into an indistinguishable stream of effort and fear. My mind flickered with fragments of my own voice reciting protocol numbers. Emergency codes, please, for extraction, interwoven with whispers from unseen sources. The voice on the radio, distorted and layered with my own tones, repeated in endless loops. Complete containment. Initiate lockdown. The protocol cannot be broken. I fought to remember who I was before this descent, before the silo devoured my reality and replaced it with endless shadows and echoing silence. Then I reached the hatch, leading into level -9. The door was massive, reinforced with layers of steel and concrete, embedded with sensors and manual overrides. A small control panel sat beside it, lit faintly by a dying screen. I approached cautiously, feeling the weight of countless warnings pressing down on me. The panel blinked as I scanned my biometric PSAXIC did. I keyed in the override code, a sequence etched into muscle memory but carried with new dread. The system hesitated, then accepted. A grinding roar filled the chamber as the door slid open, revealing the cavernous expanse of level -9. It was unlike anything I'd encountered so far. The air was thick with static electricity and an acrid temps that burned my nostrils. The floor stretched out in concentric rings of metal grates, surrounding a central core that pulsed with an eerie glow like a heart beating within the earth itself. Pipes and conduits twisted upward and outward, disappearing into shadows that no light could penetrate. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the hum, as if alive, breathing alongside me. A console sat near the entrance, its screen cracked and flickering. I approached and tried to access the system, but the interface was locked tight, encrypted beyond any standard military protocols. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for any manual controls. Then I found it, a red button, isolated and marked with a single word: contain. I hesitated. Pressing it might end the lockdown. It might also trigger something worse. The silo's voice echoed through the chamber, low and reverberating. Containment protocol active. Breach imminent. Lockdown irreversible. I knew then that the system wasn't just mechanical. It was sentient, or at least reactive, adaptive beyond human understanding. The walls pulsed harder. The lights dimmed briefly as the entire structure seemed to shudder. The air around me thickened, and a new scent filled the chamber: decay, mixed with something faintly sweet, like the last breath of a dying organism. Suddenly, alarms blared sharp, high-pitched, piercing the oppressive silence. Emergency lights flashed red and white in a strobe that disoriented and drained my strength. The floor vibrated beneath me, a deep rumble growing into a roar. Metal groaned and twisted. The silo was awakening. I barely had time to react. From the shadows at the periphery of the room, shapes began to emerge. Figures draped in shadows, their forms shifting, blurring, neither fully solid nor entirely spectral. They moved with purpose, gliding toward the core, toward me. Their presence filled the chamber with a cold that stole the warmth from my bones. I raised my weapon, fingers trembling on the trigger, but the figures paid no heed. Their eyes, when they locked with mine, were voids, black holes that sucked at my will, dragging me toward surrender. A voice, layered with my own tones, whispered from every corner of the room. The protocol must be completed. No one leaves. The silo was no longer just a prison or a labyrinth. It was a god, and I was its chosen sacrifice. As the figures closed in, the last flicker of resistance fled from my mind. The emergency lockdown was not a failsafe, it was a beginning. And in that moment, I understood the true nature of my mission: to contain, to become part of the protocol, forever. The chill in the air deepened as I descended further, the stale scent of rust and mold giving way to something far more ancient and unsettling. Each step I took echoed in the endless void, but the sound was not merely a reflection of my movement. It was as though the very walls themselves were exhaling, inhaling, alive with a slow, pulsating rhythm that matched the erratic beating of my own heart. The concrete surrounding me throbbed with a vitality I could neither see nor fully comprehend, its surfaces subtly expanding and contracting, like the flesh of some great subterranean beast trapped beneath steel and stone. The silo was no longer a structure. It was an organism, and I was crawling inside its body, trapped in its chest. My flashlight flickered in protest as the air grew heavier, denser, suffused with a humidity that clung to my skin and seeped into my lungs like a suffocating fog. I paused, breath shallow, listening to the rhythmic pulse emanating from the walls, a sound like a monstrous heartbeat, low, guttural, relentless. I reached out, pressing my gloved palm against the cold concrete, feeling the vibrations course through my flesh, a message encoded in each subtle pulse. I was intruding. The silo knew. The narrow corridor ahead narrowed still further, the ceiling dipping low enough to force me to stoop, the walls closing in like the ribs of a coffin. I forced myself forward, the oppressive weight of the silo pressing against my mind, blurring the edges of reality, twisting time until minutes stretched into eternity. Shadows writhed beneath the edges of my light, indistinct shapes flickering in the periphery, refusing to be fully seen, yet impossible to ignore. The whispers returned, too faint to understand, but loud enough to unsettle, a chorus of lost voices bleeding from cracks in the walls, mingling with the pulsing breath of the concrete beast. As I stumbled into a wider chamber, the air shifted again, a sudden dryness overtaking the dampness, and the pulse quickened, thundering through the space like a drumbeat. The walls here were different, slick and wet, glistening with a viscous film that caught the light in oily rainbows. I stepped cautiously, boots slipping slightly on the slick surface. Along the far wall, a series of panels blinked erratically, displays fractured and indecipherable, their screens flickering between static and strange symbols that twisted and coiled like living script. I moved closer to one, trying to make sense of the data streaming across the shattered interface. Suddenly, the display stabilized, and a flood of information cascaded before my eyes: temperatures, pressure readings, chemical analyses all spiking wildly, alarms flashing unseen. The silo was reacting, alerting, preparing. Whatever lived here was stirring. The breathing walls closed around me, pulsing faster now, squeezing the air, the space, the very essence of my being. My chest tightened, as if the silo sought to crush me from within. I gasped, fighting the urge to flee, to scream, to surrender to the suffocating embrace. My wrist flashed a warning. Oxygen levels critical. I tightened my grip on the weapon, every nerve screaming to survive this living nightmare. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved, slick, shifting form, gliding along the walls. Too quick to track, too fluid to capture. A creature, or a shadow. I couldn't tell. The whispers intensified, now forming words in a language I didn't know, but understood by instinct. Warning, danger, escape, impossible. I spun, training my light on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, desperate to find a foothold in this ever-shifting maze. Behind me, a panel hissed open, releasing a gust of frigid air and a sudden explosion of sound, 1,000 whispered voices rising in a terrible crescendo. I covered my ears, dropping to my knees, the world tilting as the silo's heartbeat surged in time with the screaming chorus. My vision blurred, and through the haze, I glimpsed figures emerging from the darkness, elongated shapes, distorted limbs reaching toward me with impossible grace. I scrambled backward, desperation fueling my movements, but the walls seemed to close in, pulsing with cruel intent, pressing me toward the waiting shapes. The slick floor betrayed my footing, and I fell hard, my head striking the metal grate. Stars exploded behind my eyelids, and the whispers turned to taunts, laughter echoing in my ears. Through the haze, I caught sight of a flickering lighter panel embedded in the wall, its glow beckoning like a lifeline. Summoning every ounce of strength, I crawled toward it, fingers trembling as I punched in a series of codes memorized in training. The panel beeped, and a hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow passage bathed in cool, sterile light. I dragged myself inside as the chamber behind me contracted with a final, crushing pulse, the sound of a great beast exhaling in defeat. The passage led upward, spiraling away from the pulsating tomb, carrying me toward uncertain salvation. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, but I moved, driven by primal fear and a flicker of hope. Above, the air grew lighter, the walls steadier. I emerged into a dimly lit control room, consoles blinking to life, as if awakened by my presence. Screens displayed fragmented maps, live feeds, and cryptic warnings in languages I barely recognized. I stumbled toward one display and saw a familiar emblem, a circle, intersected by a slash, the same symbol that had haunted me since the beginning. And there, on the monitor, was my own face, eyes wide, sweating, trapped in an endless loop within the depths of the silo. The walls weren't just breathing, they were watching, recording, living. I was not just a prisoner of the silo. I was its subject. And the walls, those terrible breathing walls, were the cage that held me captive. The control room's cold glow cast long, unnatural shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls, flickering like restless spirits caught between worlds. My chest heaved with exhaustion and dread as I moved toward the central console. The air thick with the metallic temps of ozone and something else, something faintly chemical. As if the place had been soaked in sterilizing agents meant to erase all traces of life and memory. The screens before me displayed a cascade of files, each labeled with dates and cryptic alphanumeric codes that blurred into one another like an endless river of secrets. Then, one file caught my eye, a folder marked with my name. Not just my name, but my image. A photograph, grainy and worn, showing a man in uniform, staring directly at the camera with a mix of determination and something else I couldn't name. It was me. I hesitated, fingers trembling. I clicked the file open. What I saw stopped me cold, a dossier containing pages of detailed records, medical charts, psychological evaluations, and video stills. Every document bore the unmistakable header of the silo's secret division. Project Protocol 091, Operative Miller. The first page was an intake report, dated years before my deployment here, outlining the recruitment, training, and monitoring of an operative selected for a mission classified beyond top secret. The language was clinical, but ominous, hinting at experiments involving cognitive resilience, memory manipulation, and sensory deprivation. I scrolled down, the pages unfolding a narrative that was both familiar and alien. Reports chronicled months of isolation training, chemical conditioning, and simulated exposures to unexplainable phenomena. My own psychological assessments were detailed with unnerving precision, notes on anxiety, dissociation, hallucinations, and episodes of fragmented identity. A name kept recurring in the files: Subject Miller. I was the subject, the test, the experiment. The project wasn't just a mission, it was a containment effort to control something inside me, or something I carried within. One video file caught my attention. I played it, and the screen filled with grainy footage of a man walking the corridors of the silo, sometimes stopped by unseen forces, sometimes staring into empty space, mumbling fragments of code and commands. The timestamps revealed multiple iterations of the same footage, looped with slight variations, as if recording different versions of the same event. At one point, the man paused, turning toward the camera with a hollow expression, eyes reflecting an abyss I feared to acknowledge. The silence was broken only by a faint, distorted whisper repeating over and over: "Containment breach imminent. Protocol failing." I shut the video off, hands shaking. How was this possible? Had I been here before? Was I a ghost trapped in an endless cycle, condemned to relive this nightmare? The files didn't offer answers, only more questions, spiraling into the depths of a truth I wasn't ready to face. Then I noticed the audio logs, recordings labeled as sessions, each time-stamped during the mission, but with voices that weren't mine, distorted, layered, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. I pressed play on the latest session. The voice was cold, mechanical, echoing through the chamber like a specter. Subject Miller exhibits dissociative episodes. Initiate reconditioning. The silo is the vessel, the protocol, the anchor. Complete the cycle. The screens around me flickered violently, as if reacting to the words. Alarms blared softly in the background, and the control room's atmosphere shifted, thickening with a palpable menace. I turned toward the door, desperate for escape, only to find it sealed shut, the panel beside it glowing ominously red. My comm unit crackled to life, a voice emerging from the static, not from command, but from within the silo itself. "You cannot leave. You are part of the system." Panic rose like a tidal wave, crashing over me. I lunged for the console, searching for any manual override, any back door to disable the lockdown. My fingers raced over the cracked keyboard, entering every code I remembered from training, every command whispered in nightmares. The screen flashed messages. Access denied. System lockdown. Protocol failure. I was trapped. Suddenly the room's temperature plunged. My breath billowed in the air, visible and frantic. The walls seemed to pulse faster, the very steel vibrating with a sinister energy. The monitors displayed flickering images, glimpses of corridors I'd walked, distorted faces watching from shadows, and, most disturbingly, my own face fractured, multiplied, twisting into shapes no human could bear. A whisper filled my ears, not through the radio, but inside my mind. Complete the cycle, Miller. Become the protocol. I collapsed against the console, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of realization. The silo wasn't just a prison or a place of secrets. It was a living entity, feeding on fear, memory, and identity. And I was both its prisoner and its sustenance. As the screens faded to black, the last thing I saw was my own face staring back at me. Eyes hollow, mouth agape, in a silent scream that echoed into the void. There is no escape, only the protocol. The screens flickered once more, not with the jagged static I'd grown used to, but with clarity sharp, vivid, and impossibly real. My eyes locked onto the grainy black and white footage displayed before me, a live feed from a camera positioned somewhere deep within the silo. The image was hauntingly familiar. A man in uniform, moving cautiously through a corridor lined with pipes and dim emergency lights. His movements were deliberate yet weary, each step measured, cautious, as if weighed down by the weight of unseen horrors. The figure paused, raising a hand to push back a falling strand of hair. The same nervous tic I had when under extreme stress. It was me, but it couldn't be me. Not entirely. The footage showed more than just a single figure. Behind Mino, behind the man in the grainy feed, there was another shadow. A figure that mimicked my every move with unnerving precision, yet its form was indistinct, like a silhouette blurred by smoke or fog. The shadow never fully emerged into the light, but its presence was undeniable, a dark echo tethered to my existence. I watched, breath caught in my throat, as the mirrored figure moved independently for a moment, its head tilting, as if observing the man it trailed, studying, waiting. The footage cut abruptly to another angle. This time it was a static shot from a fixed security camera, overlooking a large chamber, walls lined with monitors and consoles. I was there, seated at the control station, the same as I had seen earlier. But with a difference beside me, sitting rigid and expressionless, was the shadowy double from the corridor. It did not speak, did not move, simply observed with eyes that glowed faintly red through the darkness of the visor. I swallowed hard, the cold knot in my stomach tightening. This was no mere recording. It was a live loop, a recreation of my own presence, repeated endlessly in a digital echo chamber. The double was more than a reflection, it was a manifestation of the silo's grasp. A fragment of my fractured identity held hostage in the abyss. Suddenly, the footage flickered again, revealing a close-up of the control room monitor. On it was a recording of me, the real me, not the figure on screen, watching the looped feed with wide eyes and clenched fists. My own face on the screen displayed fear, confusion, and a silent plea for release. The juxtaposition was unbearable. Two versions of myself trapped in separate layers of the silo's labyrinth, each a prisoner to a twisted game of surveillance and control. Then, in a moment that shattered the fragile veil of reality, the shadow figure on the footage turned directly to the camera and impossibly locked eyes with me through the screen. It raised a hand, pressing its palm flat against the glass, as if reaching out. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The voice came then not from the radio, but from within my helmet, a distorted echo of my own tone. You are the protocol. You are the loop. You cannot leave. The room around me seemed to pulse in response, walls breathing with a slow, mechanical rhythm. The control panel's lights flickered erratically, and the monitors began displaying cryptic symbols, circles intersected by slashes, spirals folding into themselves, and strings of binary code scrolling endlessly. The silo's language. The language of entrapment. I staggered back, heart hammering, breath shallow and rapid. My reflection in the shattered glass of a nearby monitor showed a man unraveling, eyes wild with desperation and fear. The silo was more than a place. It was a Minda, sentient, malevolent entity, weaving its will through metal and memory. I keyed the radio frantically, voice breaking. "Command, do you copy? Extraction requested. I'm trapped in a loop. There are doubles of me. I don't know what's real anymore," Static answered. Then, a chilling reply in a voice layered with my own. "Complete the cycle, Miller. Become the protocol." Panic flooded through me as I realized the cruel truth. The silo wasn't merely observing. It was rewriting reality, folding time and identity into an endless loop, where I was both subject and observer, prisoner and warden. The shadow in the footage was not just a copy, it was a warning, a fragment of what awaited if I failed to escape the protocol. I swallowed my fear and forced myself to focus. The footage was a key, a message from the silo's depths. It showed the fractured paths of my existence, the multiple layers of entrapment. To survive, I would need to break free, not just from the physical labyrinth, but from the shattering fractures within my own mind. With trembling hands, I reached for the controls, determined to rewrite my fate. The shadow watched, unblinking, as the silo's pulse grew louder, drowning out the desperate echoes of my own voice. My hands trembled on the console as I stared at the fragmented images of myself, looping endlessly, tethered to an existence I desperately sought to escape. The silo's walls throbbed around me, each pulse sinking with the rapid thudding of my heart, pressing against my skin like an oppressive tide. I forced myself to breathe deep, willing my muscles to steady as I stood from the control chair and glanced toward the door, the only apparent way out. But as I stepped forward, the familiar corridor beyond the one I had just come from had vanished. In its place was a cold, seamless wall, devoid of seams, handles, or light. It was as though the silo had folded in on itself, erasing my path like a cruel sleight of hand. Panic clawed at my throat, but logic demanded calm. I turned, searching for any other exit, any crack or crevice that might lead me back to reality. The hallway behind me, the control room itself, seemed to ripple and distort, as if the very structure was breathing, reshaping itself with sentient intent. My light flickered as the walls narrowed, shifting, folding into angles that defied physics and reason. I felt as though I was walking inside a maze, built not of stone and steel, but of memory and fear. Every step forward brought new distortions, floors rising where ceilings should be, walls bending inward and outward, passages looping back, impossibly, to places I'd just passed. I called out, voice echoing hollowly, "Hello? Anyone? Command." Static swallowed my cries, and in return, the radio emitted that familiar, haunting loop of my own voice pleading, "Help me. I'm trapped. I'm trapped." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to push onward through the twisting labyrinth, every turn fracturing my grip on what was real. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, figures half seen, vanishing when I tried to focus, leaving only the lingering feeling of being watched. The temperature fluctuated wildly. Moments of suffocating heat gave way to sharp chills that bit into my bones. My helmet's HUD flickered erratically, alternating between clear readouts and indecipherable data streams, as if the silo itself sought to confuse and disorient me. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way, not collapsing but shifting like a tidal wave. I caught myself against the wall, heart racing, and watched in disbelief as the corridor stretched and spiraled downward, dragging me into its endless depths. I stumbled, and when I regained my footing, I found myself on a narrow platform overlooking a vast chasm shrouded in darkness. Across the void, another corridor floated, fragile, insubstantial, and seemingly unreachable. My breath caught as a soft glow emerged from the shadows below. Tendrils of luminescent mist curled and twisted, forming shapes too fluid and alien for any sane mind to interpret. I realized with a sinking dread that I was no longer within the silo's known structure, but in some warped, parallel layer and echo of reality where the laws of physics bent and fractured. I scanned the chasm for any sign of a bridge or passage. None existed. My only option was to traverse the fragile corridor, a narrow path of shifting metal plates that wobbled under the lightest touch. I stepped forward carefully, every movement deliberate and slow, aware that a single misstep would send me plummeting into the abyss below. Halfway across, the plates began to warp, twisting beneath my boots like living things. I struggled to maintain balance, heart pounding in my ears, sweat slicking my palms despite the cold. The corridor undulated violently, and I was forced to drop to all fours, crawling inch by agonizing inch. As I neared the far side, I heard a whisper of voice, so faint it could have been the echo of my own thoughts. "You cannot leave," it said, layered with my own tone, a cruel mimicry that chilled me to the bone. I pulled myself onto solid ground and sprinted toward the corridor's end, only to find the exit barred by a thick, translucent membrane shimmering with unnatural light. I pressed my palm against it, feeling a strange resistance, like trying to push through liquid glass. The membrane rippled and pulsated, warping my reflection until it fractured into countless shards. A surge of desperation overtook me as I slammed my fist against the barrier. "Open," I shouted, voice cracking. But the wall held firm. My vision blurred as dizziness and nausea washed over me. The silo was a living prison, and I was its captive. I fell to my knees, the membrane rippling softly, as if breathing. Through the shimmering barrier, I glimpsed a distant light, the faint glow of an exit. A promise of freedom just beyond reach. I reached out, fingertips brushing the surface, and felt an overwhelming wave of cold wash through me, searing my skin and soul. The membrane pulsed violently, then shattered like a mirror, flooding me with a blinding light that engulfed my senses. I screamed not in pain, but in terror as I was pulled through the fracture, tumbling through darkness and light, memory and nightmare, until I landed hard on cold concrete. Gasping, I opened my eyes to find myself back at the silo's surface entrance. The hatch loomed above, sunlight filtering through the dust and debris. My cum crackled to life, a voice breaking through static. "Miller, are you there? Extraction team, en route. Hold your position." Relief surged, but it was fleeting. I was free temporarily. The silo had released me, but I was changed. Part of its endless loop. A fragment of its living nightmare. The walls had shifted, but the prison remained. And deep within, somewhere in the infinite darkness, my shadow waited, watching, waiting for me to return. The exit wasn't where I left it, because this place was never meant to let me go. The scent of dust and sunlit concrete filled my lungs as I lay sprawled outside the silo's surface hatch. The fading echo of the silo's suffocating embrace still clawing at my mind. The extraction team had arrived, voices crackling over radios, boots pounding on gravel, flashlights sweeping the desolate desert landscape, but none of it felt real. I was a ghost returned from a place beyond reason, beyond time, a man fragmented by the horrors folded inside that monstrous labyrinth. I tried to speak, to tell them what had happened, but the words caught in my throat, twisted into tangled screams that no one could hear. The medics pulled me upright, their hands firm but gentle. Their questions blurred into white noise, a meaningless drone against the cacophony in my head. They hooked me up to monitors, checking vitals, but it was my mind that screamed for attention. Fractured and fragmented, like the endless corridors I had walked 1,000 times. My fingers clenched, the box still strapped to my shoulder, a weight that now felt like a shackle, a tether to a nightmare I could never leave behind. Somewhere in the distance, the radio chatter faded into static, then into silence. I closed my eyes and saw it again, the silo breathing, the walls alive, the shadow that wasn't me, but was me all the same, the loop, the protocol, the cage. Then a whisper broke through the haze, soft and insistent. Barely audible, but undeniable. This message shouldn't exist. I opened my eyes to the sterile white of the medbay, the harsh light glaring down like a spotlight on my shattered soul. A nurse approached, asking questions I couldn't answer, speaking in tones too slow and careful, as if to a child lost in a storm. I shook my head, trying to hold on to the fragments of reality before they slipped away. The silo had marked me, changed me, made me part of its endless story. Hours passed, or was it days? Time lost meaning in the sterile haze of treatment and observation. I was alone, yet haunted by voices and images that refused to fade. I reached for the cum unit, desperate to send a message, to warn anyone who might come after. My fingers trembled as I keyed the mic and whispered, "This is Miller. If you receive this, do not enter. The silo is alive. It is the protocol. It is endless." Static answered. But then, through the static, a faint signal and echo of my own voice, warped and layered with others, whispered back, "Complete the cycle." I recoiled, heart hammering, breath catching in a choke of despair. The silo's grip extended beyond its walls, beyond the earth and steel, reaching into the very fabric of communication and memory. I was trapped, a prisoner not just of place, but of signal and shadow. Days turned 2 weeks. The extraction team moved on, the site sealed once more, a black mark on forgotten maps. I remained a living archive of the silo's terrible secret, my mind a battlefield between fragments of self and the relentless protocol. My dreams were invaded by endless corridors, shifting walls, and the relentless pulse of the living structure that held me captive. And then, one night, as I drifted on the edge of sleep, the whisper returned, louder, clearer. "You are the protocol now." I jolted awake, cold sweat slicking my skin. The room was empty except for the hum of machines and the quiet drip of a leaking faucet. My reflection in the window was a stranger, a man fractured by terror and time. The box was gone from my shoulder, but the weight remained, a phantom burden I could never shed. I reached for the nurse call button, but hesitated. What could I say? Who would believe a man who had walked through the impossible and returned broken? I pressed it anyway, voice barely above a whisper, "Help me." The answer came not from the nurse, but from within the silo's voice. Folded into the static of the night, a chilling promise and a curse. The message will persist. The protocol endures. You cannot escape. I lay back, the walls of the hospital room dissolving into the endless darkness of the silo's depths. My breath slowed, matching the rhythm of a pulse far away but ever present. I was both prisoner and sentinel, part of a story that should never have been written, a message that should never exist. And yet, here I am, telling it, waiting, hoping someone will listen, before the protocol claims me completely.